I'm an old-fashioned liberal who actually not only believes in a decent society that helps its most unfortunate members survive, but who also happens to believe in freedom. My name is Harvey Silverglate. I'm a criminal defense and civil liberties lawyer, and I am the co-founder and the current chairman of the board of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Having been born and raised in Brooklyn, I had a natural inclination toward free speech. You know, we really used to say on the streets of Brooklyn, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never harm me. And we actually believed it. From a very young age, I was brought up, and not so much by my parents, they were not terribly political, but the atmosphere of the block that was my world in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst. We believed in free speech. And when I got to college, I was still a pre-med student. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. This was true of the whole generation of beleaguered Jewish boys who ended up in medicine, whether they wanted to or not. And when I got to college, I decided about midway through that really I didn't want to be a doctor. I'd go crazy spending my life in a doctor's office or in a hospital. Mind you, I have great respect for people who are really great doctors, but it wasn't the life for me. I was more interested in the ills that people inflicted on other people rather than the ills that germs inflicted on people. And so I decided to go to law school, and I decided that civil liberties and criminal law were the areas, the fields that most interested me. The intercom goes on, and it's my boss, Joe O'Terry, who said, "Harvey," because he was born here, he had a different accent than I did. "Harvey," he says, "I'm very busy, and there's a broad here who was supposed to interview me about some marijuana case. I was wondering if maybe you could take care of the broad for me so I didn't have to interrupt my work." So they sent the broad in to interview me, and it was Elsa Dorfman doing an article about this case. She was a freelance writer and photographer. I started to date the broad, and a short 9 years later, we got married. That's how I met my wife. Elsa is somebody who is quite politically incorrect. She says what she means and means what she says. Her personality is kind of like her photography. There's no guile, there's no setup. What you see is what you get.
Harvey is 1 in a million, I think. He's really amazing. Male or female, I haven't met anybody like Harvey. He's a marital subject. He puts up with it. I think he enjoys it, but I think 80% is rolling his eyes and putting up with it, I would say. It doesn't look like he's putting up with it, but it's an interruption, I think. What did he say?
I started my career representing Vietnam War protesters. I represented groups like Students for Democratic Society, the real hardcore leftists who were being persecuted on college campuses. What I was shocked about was when these students grew up and they became professors, and they suddenly had, and administrators, suddenly I realized that they never believed in free speech. They believed in their own free speech. Suddenly they were censoring the right. I would say to any student who supports speech codes and does it in the guise of supporting, liberal or progressive values, that they're totally misguided, and if the country turned into their vision of the good country, the perfect country, they would end up eventually in the gulag, because as soon as you agree that censorship is okay as long as it's only for the thought that you hate, eventually that animal is going to turn on you and you're going to end up the victim, because the ideology can turn on a dime. Today the campuses don't like the people on the right side of the political spectrum. I started school when it was the left side of the spectrum that was not liked. I've lived through these changes. The thing that makes me laugh the most is that I am considered a right-winger by people on the academic left. Only, by the way, people on the academic left are sufficiently narrow-minded to call me a right-winger. In fact, I'm a liberal, but I'm a civil libertarian liberal. I'm an old-fashioned liberal who actually not only believes in a decent society that helps its most unfortunate members survive, but who also happens to believe in freedom, because so much of the left today doesn't believe in liberty, especially the academic left. It's really, there's something wrong with calling the academic left liberalism. They're not liberals at all. They're really, they're leftist totalitarians. Why is it I represent, when I'm representing students, so many students who are conservatives? The reason is that the campus is a very hostile, alien place for students or faculty members of conservative thought. That's the reason. I do represent students on the left from time to time, when occasionally even they taste the whip of academic censorship, but more frequently my clients and campuses are conservatives, and that's only because they're the ones who are mostly victimized. Saddest thing about Harvard, and mind you, I'm a graduate of its law school. I'm supposed to be a loyal alum, and I actually consider myself a loyal alum because I'm trying to bring Harvard back to the principles that it still claims it believes in, but doesn't practice. And that is respect for free speech, academic freedom, meaning respect or at least tolerance of the most views that are considered to be obnoxious, retrograde, evil. They're only words or essays, and they should be completely protected. They're not. You could be thrown out of Harvard for saying something politically incorrect. The censorship at Harvard runs from top to bottom. It runs from the president of Harvard, who really no longer has the guts to say something politically incorrect, because the predecessor of the current president of Harvard got tossed out of office after a very short 5-year tenure because he insisted on speaking his mind. It's rather amazing. Lawrence Summers was the president of Harvard, and he got bounced after 5 years because he gave a talk about his view about the reasons why women had difficulties advancing in academic science. And one of the hypotheses he threw out, only as a hypothesis, he was not saying he was convinced it was true, but he suggested the possibility that women were not as genetically predisposed to success in academic science as men. Well, that was seen as a charge that women were inferior to men, and there was a huge uproar, and Summers was not even given an opportunity to explain what he meant and to explain the research that he was basing his speech on. He was driven out of office within half a year. Now, if a Harvard president is not free to talk about research in a hot-button area like women in science, then, of course, nobody is free to talk about anything politically controversial on that campus, and they're not. I believe that private colleges and universities, including Harvard, have a right to believe what they want, to promote whatever views it wants. If Harvard wants to be a narrow-minded institution promoting a certain way of looking at the world, a certain format of government, Harvard has the right to do that. However, I believe that Harvard also has to let the public know honestly what it is. It cannot assume the mantle of an institution devoted to academic freedom if it doesn't promote academic freedom. In other words, I think that consumers are entitled to be told the truth. I believe in truth in labeling. Harvard should simply say, okay, we've decided that we want to promote a certain kind of political philosophy, and anybody who doesn't go along with it should not be on the faculty and should not be in the student body. Students are far less free now than they were in the 60s and 70s on American college campuses. You have some of the protests now that students had in the 60s and 70s, and students would be expelled for it, wouldn't be tolerated. You've got a situation where students look different but think alike. Now, do they really think alike? No, my experience is the students don't really think alike, but they are afraid and hesitant to express their real views. And so you get students who pretend that, oh, the current notion of diversity, multiculturalism, and so forth, they agree with these views. In fact, they don't. If they're talking to you privately, they will say, wow, you really can't express what you really think at Harvard. So they pretend to go along with it, but that's a very corrosive atmosphere for a university, to have people afraid to say that they don't go along with what is the reigning view on the campus. Every time I hear another absurd story, I go, oh no. But ultimately, I am optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is because there is no way that the current university, as it is, the politically correct university, can survive. It is there's too much of an internal conflict, and I think that the eternal devotion of universities to academic freedom, free thought, and fairness is going to ultimately trump, and the modern PC university is going to bite the dust.